The end of July of the year 1979, a small town about 20 miles south of Kansas City, Missouri, two friends, Mike Fisher and Brian Evetson, ages of 22 and 18 respectively, went on a road trip taking Mike's Kawasaki 1300. They were meeting friends for a camping weekend in the Ozarks. They were driving down in a pickup truck and bringing all the camping supplies. Mike had an Australian shepherd named Zeke who also rode on the motorcycle. The trip almost didn't really get started because a mile out of town, Zeke, who rode on the very back of the motorcycle, licked Brian on the neck, causing him to move unexpectedly in a motion which accidentally pushed Zeke off the back of the bike. But as this happened, Brian realized what he did, and with his hand on the side of the bike which Zeke was falling off, Brian was able to catch him and push him back up on the bike. This all happened at about 70 miles per hour without Mike's knowledge. Once they got past that little hiccup, it was still a difficult ride. Brian had never ridden long distance before, and frankly, it was not a pleasant trip for him. Sandwiched between Mike and the dog, he basically felt he was hanging on for his life the entire ride down to the Ozarks, which was a 5-hour drive. To add salt into the wound, it began to get misty, just short of being a rain. They would run into short bursts of moisture coming down hard enough to sting them as they drove through it. They discussed the situation, and there was a choice to either power through it, since it wasn't to the extreme of being cause for stopping, or they could try to wait it out. But for one, the trip was just for the weekend, and second, they were meeting their dates down there, who were riding down in the pickup. Anybody hearing this story that has had the testosterone of a male over the age of 12 understands why two young men that had their dates waiting on them chose to ride through the stinging mist to be able to arrive on time. The two separate parties met up with about 2 hours left of daylight for them to find their spot to camp and get their camping tents and assorted paraphernalia organized and set up for the night. Arriving in the pickup were Sam Sweeten, his date Kim, Mike's date Nicole, and Brian's date Michelle. The two parties found a camping area which were not terribly crowded and decided to make that their spot. They were running out of time before the night was setting in. Thankfully, the mist overcast weather was left behind, so the night was clear and the stars were out. It was the average July night in the Ozarks, so it was warm and a little humid. There was no breeze and the atmosphere hung heavy, which was a hint that the misty, rainy weather the boys had rode through was either about to arrive or perhaps it was passing to one side of them or the other, and they were just getting the humidity of the passing storm without the actual moisture in the form of rain or mist. Dinner consisted of hot dogs and plenty of beer. If there was any trouble in the campground that night, the group as a whole slept through it, or there simply was nothing for reason to be woke up in the middle of the night. However, that was not the case the following night. They spent the day swimming and playing around. Some grass was smoked, but the booze was left alone for the evening, which meant they were all went into that following night sober. And things started happening shortly after it got dark, so although everybody was drinking beer, there was nobody who had reached the point of being drunk. The campground itself was really nothing more than a gravel parking lot that was alongside the lake. There were many tall trees which provided the campers shade in the daytime, but at night they blocked out seeing the stars, which made the campground seem even darker than it really was, because the campground did not enjoy any of the moonlight which helped illuminate the parts of the park which did not have the shade. Since arriving late to get their camping tents set up, the group decided to put them close together, which turned out to be a blessing, because if they hadn't been so close together out of the gate, they would have been before that second night was finished. Things started out creepy, because there were some howls that came from the forest which nobody could identify. Mike's dog Zeke was far from calm. He would go from being up with his ears perked to sort of whining and then ending up between Mike's legs, and then he would go back to being on the alert and do the whole routine over again. It had the girls very uptight, and if the boys didn't have to act tough for the sake of the ladies, they would have admitted they weren't feeling too safe being out there with only the tent and each other for protection. Although nobody said anything out loud, none of the boys were working out their elbows like usual. Brian's date, Michelle, even brought it up that nobody was drinking much beer. The point was thrown out there, but nobody seemed too interested in addressing the matter, mostly because the boys couldn't have put into words what their subconscious recognized. Something was off that night. strange sounds coming from the forest, the fact it was a weekend, and yet as they looked around the campground they could see they were the only ones who had decided to spend the night. The previous night they had several neighbors camping. It was just sort of odd that nobody else was staying the night. A cold front was moving in. Perhaps that was why nobody else was camping. The group had drove over 5 hours to get there, and nobody had checked the weather. Perhaps everybody else had been warned the cold was moving in. It made for a creepy late night because not only did the temperature drop, but a fog started to roll in off the lake, which made seeing anything more than a few feet in front of you almost impossible. Now imagine you've driven 5 hours to a gravel or dirt road, which then took you on a spiraling trip down further and further down until you finally see a spot in the woods where you can turn off this dirt road, and it takes you down into an area which is thick with tall trees. On the far side of the parking lot area, you can spot the water. The first night camping there are several other groups out there also camping. The darkness is a bit overwhelming to people who were accustomed to living in an area where you could see the glow of a city on the horizon, where neighbors were close together and up and down the street there were houses which had their outside lights on. The average American neighborhood with the house about every 50 paces. Conversation is something which you very nearly cannot be avoided unless you're wearing headphones. Even then you're likely to hear the occasional yell which may or may not be meant for your ears. Compare that to the solitude offered out at a campground of one of the Ozark lakes on a night which is a cold front moving in, ushering in a fog off the lake, and there are no other camping, so there is no comfort of safety in numbers. For instance, that first night they slept out there under the dark canopy of the evergreen trees, they could hear the other campers chatting, and they could see their lanterns and flashlights, all of which loudly announced that here was a safe place for humans to pass the night. Now this second night, the only thing being heard loud and clear was that howl which nobody recognized. To make matters more frustrating, the howls seemed to be getting closer to where the three couples were camping. Zeke was more uneasy than ever. He is almost to the point of being restless or in a full-on defensive mode. Suffice to say, he was just short of growling and obviously was uneasy with the current situation. The three couples talked it over, and despite the fact the fog had become so thick that it was like something out of a B-grade monster movie, they didn't want to try and go anywhere because, for one, riding the motorcycle in heavy fog was not a wise idea. But also because they didn't want to spend the money for a night on a hotel room, because by the time they found the hotel, more than half the night would be over. They would be paying for basically just the last half of the night, which meant mostly sleeping, and let's face it, boys that age do not see it as a financially wise decision to spend money on a hotel room that you will only get half a night's return on your investment. So suffice to say, it was decided that no matter what, they were not getting a hotel room, which sort of cemented them where they were at, since, as mentioned, moving very far in the fog on the motorcycle was not wise. Add into that the fact they couldn't just go home, and the conclusion was to stay where they were at. The three couples huddled together after talking everything over, and it was decided, since they couldn't really go anywhere, that they might as well stop freaking each other out and just cut loose and get drunk. Mike was the one who pushed that narrative, and the other guys tried to get behind the sentiment, but they weren't selling it very well. The girls, on the other hand, had never bought into the whole let's get drunk and be brave idea. And while the boys were busy convincing each other there was nothing to worry about, so why not get drunk, the ladies were busy listening, and what they had to report was not good news. Something was moving around out there. While the boys were laughing it up and getting their courage built up, something had moved in closer to their campsite and was moving in a circle around the campsite. Once the boys stopped their laughing and shut up, the sound of the gravel crunching under heavy footsteps could be heard. Nobody in the campsite was smiling now. The girls were on the brink of going into full panic mode, which wouldn't have been good for anybody. Mike began to make threats to the fog. He claimed he could tell there was someone out there moving around our campsite, and if they wanted to keep pushing their luck, they might find out they were messing with the wrong people. He continued to speak at the fog, but got nothing back except in the distance the sound of that howl continued. They had originally thought that was what was making that howling sound was also what was walking around the campsite, but it couldn't be, unless, of course, there were more than just one of them. The tents were right up next to the pickup truck and the motorcycle. Eventually, Mike put Zeke in the cab of the truck since it seemed to calm him down, and in fact, he went and laid down on the passenger side of the floorboard. Bathroom necessity became an issue almost immediately. Any time there is beer and screaming girls, you can rest assured that one or more of them is going to need to pee. And the problem was that getting the girls to go more than 3 steps away from the campsite was now an impossible dream. Actually, as it turned out, none of the group relished the idea of splitting up their numbers, which resulted in a comical situation. Well, they probably would have described it as being a situation which would have been comical if not for the seriousness of it all. It was decided that they would all go together. Everyone else would turn their backs to the person going pee so they could look something like a football team huddle, one that moved across the landscape in unison. If you would have seen them from a distance, while they were still visible among the fog, you would have seen a group of people all holding flashlights and lanterns that were moving across the landscape while laughing and carrying on. They didn't really even go that far from the tents since they were just peeing. And after everybody had their turn and they moved the entire group back over to the tents, they almost missed them. The laughter had picked back up even though they were worried about what was out there circling the campsite. When moving in unison as one, the group felt pretty safe, which allowed for the laughter to find a foothold. Perhaps it was sheer nerves. Maybe it was a combination of alcohol and the other factors together. The group returned to their spot around the tents and the pickup truck and the motorcycle. Then Mike noticed the light in the cab of the pickup truck was on. He made his way across the group to the pickup and peered inside. Zeke was gone. The door on the far side of the pickup truck was left open. Something or someone had opened the truck door while they were all over there just a short ways away peeing. Mike began to call for his dog while the others tried to console him and keep him from wandering out into the dark fog searching for Zeke. That might be exactly what they want us to do, nearly everyone pointed out to Mike. They got him settled down, and then everyone listened to see if the fog was going to allow any noise to reach their ears. All they could hear, beside the constant sound of something walking around the camp, was the consistent sound of the lake waves lapping against the shore the way a wind-up watch ticks over and over, never ending. Combined with the way the fog and the darkness helped to confuse the senses, it was almost hypnotic. The group was blessed with the hormones of the young, however, which overwhelmed any feelings of sedation, and the same courageous hormones that could withstand the most insensitive of rejections would not be overtaken by even the best effort that nature could try to use against them. The girls might have been kept awake by sheer fright of what was roaming around the campsite, but the boys were kept awake by frustration. Any guy knows he isn't going to get a girl to take clothes off when she is basically in the fight or flight mode. Good luck with that. If there's one thing that will bring the courage out of a young man, it's when he realizes his window of opportunity is closing. Eddie Murphy possibly stated it best when, from a quote in his movie 48 Hours, as Eddie is losing his potential date to someone else, he flashes his gun so the other man can see it, and then Eddie proclaims, "Lack of poontang make a man brave." You may remember that was not the exact words used, but it is the closest we can get here. Well, the boys were seeing that their night evaporated into a wasted series of hours which could have been spent getting drunk and then bedded. This nightmare was like an accidentally turning down a street which is marked dead end, and instead of manning up and just turning around there, you choose to drive all the way down to where the street actually does indeed prove to be a dead end. Now you get to drive all the way back to where you could have turned around, and then from there you can again begin to live your life. That was a rookie mistake, and these boys were not amateurs. They recognized when your game was rained out and there was nothing else to do but go home and find something to do indoors. About the time they got Mike settled down, a bark came from somewhere out there in the fog. Zeke was alive! Mike began once again to call for the dog, but they were able to keep him near the tents with the rest of the group. Brian pointed out that if the dog was heard, then it meant it was still alive and quite possibly was moving around on its own out there in the fog. They were far better off letting the dog find them than to try and find it in the fog. So there they were. A cold night, full of fog, and then the thing that was circling their campsite, and then Zeke coming up missing. The huge, unforgiving lake on one side, exhaling fog like it had just run a marathon, and a forested world which held all kinds of unknown dangers on the other. This was the perfect rock and a hard place you often hear about. Every 5 minutes, Mike would go through a routine of calls for his dog, which provided no results. The girls were ready to explode. Quite possibly the only thing keeping them from it was the fact that it would have done no good. The three couples sat huddled together, except for the times when Mike would stand up and call for his dog. Next came the rocks. They weren't big, for the most part. Actually, almost all of them were just gravel from the parking lot. Since they were seemingly not thrown with any sort of acceleration, it is fair to assume the rocks were likely tossed like one would throw a horseshoe rather than like one would throw a baseball. It was apparently not done to injure, but rather for intimidation, the mental aspect. If constant intimidation was their desired goal, then it was accomplished with extreme effect. The kids were never given a moment to relax or think they were off the hook. What was really curious was just how many of them did it take to keep a constant vigilance of stomping around the campsite while at the same time throwing that constant rain of gravel. But wait, there's more. There was also that howling which continued throughout the night. It was so foreign that it just had to be associated with these things, which were starting to get on the guys' patience. Next, the worst yet was done to them. They began to notice the gravel, which was being pitched in at them, had suddenly taken a much different texture. One of the girls was the first to find it on her body, which caused her to scream. The boys got her settled down, and it turned out the gravel had been traded for flesh. That's right, now little pieces of flesh from something which had been very recently killed were being flung at the kids. Immediately Mike worried it was Zeke. Could they have caught him and done this to the little guy? There was no way to really know because the pieces of flesh did not have any fur attached to them. Mike hollered more threats at the dark fog, promising severe retaliation if he found out that it was his dog that was being flung at them in little pieces at a time. About 2 hours from the sunup, the guys came to a conclusion that whatever was out there had intended to hurt them, that they would have been hurt by now, which they screamed into the dark fog until they realized that now they could actually see. It was still very foggy, but the sun had risen. Even better was Zeke came running into the campsite. That changed everything. The boys continued to scream into the fog, only now they were explaining they had come there from a long ways distant, and that they were going to return home. They told the fog that they were never going to return to the area, and as a thank you for not harming the dog. The truth was they didn't know if the dog had escaped and saved himself, or if the creatures had chosen to not kill or harm it. The benefit of doubt was given. The boys explained they had no idea they were trespassing. If they had known, they would not have come, which is why they will not be back. It is unknown, of course, if anything they said made any sort of difference, but they were able to leave the area without further incident. Of course, they could not leave until the fog had lifted enough to allow Mike to ride the bike. Brian opted to ride back in the pickup, even if it meant riding in the back part. It was okay, he had company. Zeke also rode back in the pickup. Mike decided he had defied death enough for one weekend. An hour into the morning, and the sun was up high enough that now all the shadows, which had threatened to hide whatever it was that haunted them all night, quickly shrunk to sizes which, if they did still harbor anything evil, it was certain to be small enough it could be handled. Trees began to appear where just a few seconds prior had been nothing but fog, and then they could see the outline of the parking lot and a good portion of the tall trees which towered over them. Finally, they could see the entrance exit to the parking lot, and then beyond that, the dirt road which had brought them to the campsite. Of course, they had everything packed up and ready to travel. They were just waiting for the fog to lift. 10 minutes before they left, they heard another of the howls that had haunted them all the night. Mike yelled back a goodbye, that they were leaving. Then he finished by yelling that next time they showed their disapproval of the use of this campground to think of them, because he and his friends were sure going to think of them, the things in the fog, whenever they had a spooky night. And then he said into the fog, was there something he could do if he ever found himself in the same situation, to communicate he was not any sort of threat and that he would be leaving at first light? To everyone's great surprise, a pine cone came tumbling into the campsite with the middle of it whittled out. Mike and the others concluded that they should place the pine cone up where it could be seen. The problem was that nobody of the three couples had any desire to ever go back out where they could find themselves in such a situation again. That said, it might be a good idea to pluck the middle of a pine cone when you're camping and place it where it can be seen easily by anybody coming near your campsite. Thanks for visiting. Please subscribe as it really helps out all upstart channels like this one. It is appreciated. Godspeed to all.